Welcome everybody to today's tutorial. I'm Scott McMillan, project lead for the IHSS Benchmark Dashboard. In this video, I'm going to show you how to reformat your data from your reporting system once you've exported it into Excel using the Power Query function within the Microsoft 365 version of Excel. So unfortunately, if you have an earlier version of Excel that does not have the Power Query function, you will have to consult a different video in order to show you how to reformat your data that way. But before we look at how to reformat the data, I think it's first important to understand how the data needs to be laid out and formatted in order for it to be uploaded into the benchmark dashboard. That way we know where we need to get to. What you're seeing here is just a sample of a data set that is formatted in the proper way for the benchmark dashboard. A couple of things to note. If you're not familiar with the benchmark dashboard, when we ask for your data, for you to export your data from your system and provide it, there's really only 8 data fields or 8 columns of information that we're asking for. If we start on the top left here, the first thing we want to know is what the facility that it happened in. And that, of course, is important, especially if you're providing data for more than one facility, because we want to trace them back to the respective facility. We also would like the report number. And then, of course, we need the incident category, which is crucial. We want to know the date and the time of when the incident occurred. Now, if your reporting system exports it into Excel and combines the date and time into one column, that's completely acceptable. We also would like to know where the incidents are happening within the facility, particularly at the department, unit, and area level. And lastly, we'd like to know the workplace violence typology as defined by the IHSS for, of course, those violence-specific incidents, as well as law enforcement involved. And law enforcement involved refers to situations where you had to call an external law enforcement agency to come to your facility to help you in managing a particular incident. Now, if your reporting system does not have a default data field, or you're not able to repurpose, for example, a drop-down to capture either of these, then of course you wouldn't be expected to provide data if you don't have it. So the other important thing to understand about how the data needs to be laid out is that each row needs to represent an individual incident category. It's not a specific report, but rather a category that has happened and assigned to that report. What that means is if your reporting system allows you to capture multiple categories in a given report, we need for each of those categories to be represented in their own row, which allows us to then count them individually, and in turn allows us to create benchmarks on them individually. So for example, the 2 rows that are highlighted in red, if I zoom in, we can see that they share the same report number. And that is exactly what we want to see. That means that this report had 2 different categories attached to it. One of them happens to be an aggression category, and the other one happens to be a patient restraint. But having them separated allows us to run separate benchmarks on them. So now that we understand how the data needs to be formatted, let's now take a look at how we can reformat data if it's not in this exact particular format. So we're going to now take a look at a sample data set. Now this data set is an example of how a particular reporting system might allow you to capture multiple categories per report, but it doesn't separate them into their own rows. And we can see that when we look at the row, the column with the ID number, we can see that we don't see any numbers repeated. And that's because one row equals one report. Instead, this particular format, the system takes those multiple categories and it instead splits them up into their own columns. So we can see here, for example, column C contains category 1. And if we go to the right, we can see category 2, category 3, category 4. And if I continue to scroll, we can see that there's actually a 5th and 6th columns with 6 categories. What that tells me is that this particular data set contains at least one report that has 6 different categories attached to it. What we need to do is we need to reformat this so that each one of these categories is in its own row. And we're going to do that using Power Query. So the first step to do that is we need to highlight all of our data. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. I like to highlight only the cells that actually have data in them. That way we don't have a lot of blank columns and rows. So to do that, I'm going to click on the top left cell, which is A1. I'm going to hold the Shift and Control button on my keypad, and I'm going to slightly just tap the right arrow key. And what that's going to do is highlight only the columns that have something in the header, which is that first row. I'm going to continue to hold Shift and Control, and I'm going to push down on the arrow pad. And that will now highlight all the rows that actually contain data. Again, it just avoids having a bunch of extra columns and rows that are blank that I don't need. Now that we've highlighted our data, at the very top on your ribbon, you've got some options. You're going to want to click on the one that says Data. Within that, on the left-hand side here, we want this option that says From Table Range. So we're going to click on that. A little pop-up box is just going to ask us to confirm, is this the data range that you want? And it contains all of the rows and columns that I've highlighted, so that's excellent. The other thing you want to make sure is that you have this checkbox checked off. This is to indicate that your columns actually have titles to them, or headers, which they do and which is very important, so we're going to click OK. This is now going to bring up a new page. And this page contains our data, but this is just a copy of the actual data. So we're not going to be making any changes to the actual data just yet. This is actually contained at the top left here. You'll notice it says Power Query Editor. This is now using the Power Query function within Excel. It's going to allow us to make some formatting changes. And once we're happy with those changes, then we can actually launch it and it'll actually recode the data itself. So what we're trying to accomplish here is we want to take all of these 6 columns and we want to convert them into their own row. So to do that, we're going to highlight them. So to highlight here, you're going to have to click on the first one, hold your Control button, and then select each of the other columns. Now that we've selected the columns, we're going to want to right-click, and you'll need to right-click on the top here. If you try to right-click anywhere else, it's going to cancel the highlighting, and you'll have to do it again. So on the very top here, it doesn't matter which one, we'll right-click, and we have several options. We are going to want to use the very bottom one, which is called Unpivot Only Selected Columns. There's 3 different unpivot options, but we want to unpivot only on the columns that we've highlighted. So we're going to select this option. Now, what that's done is it's now converted those 6 columns into one column, which is called Value. And we can see that every row now has its own category, and we've lost all of those other 6 columns. So this is a great start to where we want to get to. And in fact, if we scroll to the far left where a report number is contained, we should see report numbers are starting to be repeated. And that's what we see. We see this one has report 1, report 1, report 1. That means that this particular report must have 3 different categories to it. And if we scroll to the right, we should see the first 3 rows are different unique categories. And they are. We've got an intrusion alarm, a break and enter, and property damage. So this is exactly how we want it to look. But there's just one other step that we need to do here. Actually, 2 steps. The first one is, you'll notice that we have this new column that suddenly appeared when we did that unpivot. It's called attribute. And what attribute is now, it's identifying whether or not this category was a category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. So it's telling us which column it originally belonged to. We don't need this. And in fact, we want to remove it because we're going to perform another function that's going to remove any duplications in our data. But we can't remove duplicates if this column is still used to identify these. So we're going to simply right-click and hit remove. The last step that we need to do is we just want to remove those duplicates. So we're just going to highlight all of the columns because we want to remove duplicates across all of our data. We're going to right-click, and we're going to use the function that specifically says remove duplicates. And that's going to remove anything that's exactly the same, because it's possible when somebody wrote a report that they may have actually added the same category twice, which is now going to be counted separately. But we don't want that because it's not actually two separate incidents. It's the same incident that's just simply being repeated. So this remove duplicates will remove any of those situations where the same category was added to the same report twice. So we'll click on remove duplicates, and it's now removed all of those duplicates. And that, folks, is all that it takes to reformat the data into the proper benchmark dashboard format. We are now ready to apply these to the actual data. So on the very top left, there's an option called close and load, and we're going to click on that. And what it's done is it's now taken our original data and it's now applied all of those reformatting steps to it. And it's actually creating it as a separate tab, which is great. So we don't lose the original data. We always have that still available to us. And one of the things that we can check to see whether or not this really did work is we can look at how many rows there are in both data sets and compare them. We should expect to have more rows of data in this new data set because we've converted those other columns into their own row. And on the right-hand side here, you'll notice it tells us that there are 523 rows that were in this. So remember that number, 523. We'll now go to the original data set. We'll just highlight a column so that we can do a quick count. And we see down below that this particular data set originally had only 369 rows. So that is, again, further evidence that this formatting worked, because we now have more rows of data in exactly the way it needs to be laid out. You can now take this data set, you can save it as its own file, and you will now use that to upload into the benchmark dashboard to continue on with the process. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope this was extremely helpful. If you have any questions, by all means, just reach out to the IHSS or myself, and we're happy to help. Thank you very much, and good luck.